What happens when you strength train after 40? After 40, strength training does not just change how your body looks, it intervenes in a biological decline that, left unaddressed, will quietly determine the quality of every decade that follows. Don't forget to subscribe, i.e., comment and share for others to benefit. There is a moment that arrives for many people somewhere in their early to mid-40s. They notice that recovery from physical effort takes longer than it used to, that the muscle they built in their 20s and 30s seems harder to maintain, that body composition is shifting in ways that diet and casual exercise are no longer able to fully address, that the energy and physical resilience they once took for granted now requires deliberate effort to access. Most people interpret this as the body beginning its inevitable decline. They adjust their expectations downward and assume that the trajectory is fixed. It is not fixed. What is happening is biological, specific, and, critically, responsive to a very precise intervention. Strength training after 40 does not slow down a clock that cannot be stopped. It changes the underlying physiology that is driving the decline at the level of muscle tissue, bone density, hormonal function, metabolic rate, neurological health, and cellular aging. The changes it produces are not cosmetic adjustments. They are systemic biological interventions with consequences that extend decades forward. Understanding what actually happens inside the body when someone over 40 begins or sustains a consistent strength training practice changes everything about how that practice is approached and how urgently it is prioritized. The sarcopenia problem and why it begins before you feel it. Sarcopenia is the medical term for the progressive loss of skeletal muscle mass and function that accompanies aging. It does not begin at 60 or 70. Research consistently shows that in the absence of adequate resistance training stimulus, measurable muscle loss begins in the early 30s and accelerates through each subsequent decade. By the time most people reach their mid-40s, they have already lost a meaningful percentage of the muscle mass they had at their physical peak, often without realizing it, because the loss has been gradual enough to remain below the threshold of obvious functional limitation. The weight on the scale may not have changed dramatically, but the composition underneath has shifted. Less muscle, more fat occupying the same space, with a metabolic and functional profile that is meaningfully different from what existed a decade earlier. Strength training is the only intervention shown to reverse sarcopenia. Not slow it, reverse it. Studies conducted on individuals in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond consistently demonstrate that progressive resistance training produces measurable increases in muscle fiber size, muscle protein synthesis rates, and functional strength, regardless of age at initiation. The biological machinery for muscle growth does not expire at 40. It becomes less efficient, and it requires a more deliberate and intelligent stimulus to activate. But it remains fully operational. What happens to bone density and why it matters more than most people realize? Parallel to the loss of muscle mass, the post-40 body is undergoing a second structural change that receives even less attention in mainstream fitness conversation despite its profound long-term health implications. Bone density peaks in the late 20s and begins a gradual decline through the 30s that accelerates significantly in the 40s for both men and women. This process is governed in part by the mechanical loading signals that bone tissue requires to maintain its density. The same principle that governs muscle. Use it or lose it, but operating on a slower and less visible timescale. Bone is living tissue. It is in a constant state of remodeling. Old bone is broken down by cells called osteoclasts, and new bone is built by cells called osteoblasts. The balance between these two processes is influenced by mechanical loading. When bones are subjected to the compressive and tensile forces generated by resistance training, the osteoblast activity is upregulated and the net remodeling balance shifts toward bone deposition rather than bone loss. Walking and swimming, while valuable for cardiovascular health, do not generate the mechanical forces required to significantly stimulate bone remodeling. Resistance training does. The axial loading of a squat or deadlift, the compressive forces of a heavy press, the tensile demands placed on bone by the muscles pulling against it during a loaded row. These are the stimuli that maintain and in many cases rebuild bone density in adults past their peak bone mass years. The clinical relevance of this is substantial. Osteoporosis and osteopenia, conditions of reduced bone density that dramatically increase fracture risk, affect a large and growing proportion of adults over 50. The interventions that most reliably prevent and reverse these conditions are weight-bearing resistance exercises. Beginning strength training in the 40s, before significant bone density loss has accumulated, is one of the most impactful long-term health decisions available to a person at that life stage. The skeleton being maintained today is the one that will or will not fracture in a fall at 65 or 75. That outcome is being shaped right now by what is or is not happening in the weight room. The hormonal recalibration that training produces. Here is where the biology of strength training after 40 becomes particularly meaningful, and where the difference between people who age with physical vitality and those who experience accelerated decline is most clearly established. The fourth decade of life brings a well-documented decline in the primary anabolic hormones, testosterone in men, estrogen and progesterone in women, and growth hormone in both. These hormonal shifts are real, clinically significant, and directly responsible for many of the physical changes people over 40 attribute simply to getting older. Reduced muscle protein synthesis efficiency, slower recovery, increased tendency toward fat accumulation, declining libido, reduced bone density, impaired sleep quality. All of these have partial roots in the hormonal changes of midlife. Strength training does not stop this hormonal decline, but it produces a set of hormonal adaptations that meaningfully counteract its effects and optimize the hormonal environment that remains. The neurological and cognitive dimension. The final layer of what strength training does after 40 is the least expected and perhaps the most profound. And it has nothing to do with the body from the neck down. Resistance training is a potent stimulus for brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the same protein elevated by aerobic exercise that supports neuronal survival, promotes new neural connection formation, and protects against the cognitive decline associated with aging. The BDNF response to resistance training operates through a different pathway than the response to aerobic exercise, meaning that combining both forms of training produces a synergistic neurological benefit that neither produces in full isolation. Studies tracking cognitive function in adults over 40 consistently show that those who engage in regular resistance training demonstrate better performance on executive function tasks, working memory, and processing speed than age-matched sedentary controls. The structural brain changes associated with this, including greater hippocampal volume and more robust prefrontal cortex connectivity, are measurable on imaging and represent genuine neuroprotection against the cognitive aging trajectory that sedentary midlife adults experience. There is also the matter of proprioception and neuromuscular control. These are the systems governing balance, coordination, and the body's moment-to-moment spatial awareness, systems that degrade with age and inactivity, and are directly responsible for the fall risk that becomes a significant health concern for older adults. Strength training challenges and thereby maintains these systems continuously. The 45-year-old who trains consistently is building the neuromuscular reserve that will determine physical stability and independence at 70. Conclusion: after 40, the body is not winding down. It is recalibrating. The hormonal environment is shifting. The muscle maintenance signals are becoming less efficient. The bone remodeling balance is changing. The neural and cognitive aging processes are accelerating or decelerating depending on the physical demands being placed on the system.